It was an ordinary evening in September, the kind that started warm but grew cool as the sun dipped lower. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet only a small town could know. No rush of traffic, just the sounds of distant chatter and laughter. But for Abana Williams, this night was anything but ordinary. The usual weight in her chest had transformed into something darker, something more dangerous. The crushing jealousy that had taken root in her heart months ago was now a raging fire. She paced back and forth, glancing every so often at her phone. Her boyfriend, Danny, had been distant lately, his phone calls few and his messages curt. But it wasn't just his behavior that unsettled her. It was his mother, Melissa Weston. Abana's anger toward her had been bubbling under the surface for a while, always hidden beneath the surface of what seemed like civil conversations. But now, that anger had twisted into something more dangerous. Melissa was a force. She wasn't just a mother-in-law. She was the woman who had raised Danny, the woman he would always side with. Abana had always felt like an outsider in his world, someone who didn't quite belong. The constant comparing, the subtle hints that Abana wasn't enough for her son, Melissa's subtle disapproval had chipped away at Abana's self-esteem until she was a shadow of the confident woman she once was. Now, with every glance and every word, Melissa seemed to loom larger in her life, a figure Abana could never escape. Her jealousy wasn't just directed at Danny anymore. It was aimed at everything his mother represented: strength, control, and the unspoken power she held over him. It was the final straw, the breaking point. Abana knew, deep down, that something had to be done. The temptation to lash out, to make Melissa feel her wrath, burned in her veins like a poison. As Abana stewed in her frustration, her phone buzzed. It was Danny. The message was brief. "Can't talk now. Call you later." That was it. No affection, no apologies for the distance between them. It was like he was shutting her out. Every moment of her growing anger surged to the surface, threatening to consume her. Abana's mind raced, her thoughts fragmented but increasingly violent. The idea of confronting Melissa, of telling her exactly what she thought of her, wasn't enough anymore. No, something more had to be done, something permanent, something that would make her boyfriend and his family understand the cost of disrespecting her. Abana stood outside the darkened house, her mind clouded by the sheer force of her emotions. The idea had seemed so simple when it first came to her. She wasn't sure why or how it had escalated so quickly, but the notion of burning down the house felt like the only way she could regain control of the situation. It would send a message she wasn't sure anyone would ever forget, but the cost of that decision, the weight of it, hadn't fully dawned on her yet. The house belonged to Melissa, but Danny had grown up here. Abana had always felt like an intruder, a visitor in a house that didn't belong to her, a house that belonged to Danny and his mother, a house filled with memories that Abana would never have, memories she couldn't possibly replace. That was the root of the resentment, of the idea that Danny's loyalty would always lie with his mother. The plan was simple, almost too simple. All she had to do was destroy what Melissa held dear, her home, her sanctuary. That would hurt her. That would make her understand just how much Abana had suffered under the weight of her judgment. And if Danny was upset, so be it. Maybe this would make him see things her way, make him finally choose her over his mother. Her hand shook as she reached for a brick that had been discarded near the sidewalk, a jagged, uneven object that felt like the perfect tool for destruction. Abana stood for a moment, staring at the house, her heart pounding in her chest, a deep breath. She was about to take the first step towards something irreversible. Without thinking, she hurled the brick through the window of the living room, the sound of shattering glass slicing through the quiet night. Her breath quickened, her pulse thundering in her ears. Adrenaline surged through her veins. It felt good, this release, this tiny act of destruction. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She was already at the front door, her hand reaching for the knob. The house was dark, and the cold air hung heavily around her. Her mind was clouded with rage, yet a part of her still hesitated, unsure of the extent of the chaos she was about to unleash. She knocked on the door, demanding a lighter from a neighbor, her voice cold, her expression hard. They didn't question her. She lit the match, feeling an unsettling calm wash over her as she approached the house again. She had no idea what was coming. She wasn't thinking about the consequences, not about the lives inside, or the people who would be affected by this act. It was the feeling of power, the moment when her anger controlled her. Abana threw the match into the broken window, watching as the flame ignited and began to spread across the dry wood. Within seconds, the house was ablaze, crackling and roaring in the night. She didn't stop to watch it burn. She didn't look back. The fire blazed into the sky, a chaotic, furious thing, devouring the house in its path. Abana stood across the street, staring blankly at the inferno she had created, unsure of what to feel. Her pulse raced, her breathing shallow, as she realized that the fire wasn't just a symbol of her anger, it was real. It was destroying something tangible, something irreplaceable, but still, she couldn't bring herself to care. Inside the house, the victims had no way of escaping. The two children, young boys, had been playing in the living room, laughing and oblivious to the danger. Their grandmother, Melissa Weston, had been upstairs, too far from the front door when the fire began to spread. The smoke suffocated them all, suffocating their hopes, their futures, their lives. As the fire truck screamed toward the scene, Abana stood frozen, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. It felt like an eternity before the sirens grew louder and people began to gather in the street. Some of them cried out in horror, others watched, helpless. No one had seen the figure standing in the shadows, the one who had lit the match. No one knew yet that the chaos had been set in motion by Abana's reckless, unforgiving desire to lash out. But as the police arrived and began to investigate, it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. The fire department worked quickly, but it was too late to save anyone. The damage was done. Within hours, the authorities had arrived and begun their investigation. Neighbors were questioned, firefighters gave their reports, and soon the pieces of the puzzle began to form. Witnesses had seen Abana around the area earlier in the night, pacing restlessly, as if she were waiting for something. The messages she had sent to Danny, the ones filled with rage and venom, painted a damning picture. The connection was undeniable. But Abana refused to acknowledge her guilt. She tried to convince herself that she hadn't meant to cause anyone harm, that the fire wasn't meant to hurt anyone. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had set the fire on purpose. And now, as the police began piecing together the evidence, Abana was trapped. Abana couldn't shake the feeling that everything was closing in on her. Each day since the fire felt heavier, as though the weight of her actions was pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. At first, the shock and disbelief had been overwhelming. She told herself that everything would be fine. After all, no one could trace the fire back to her, right? It was just an accident, something that got out of hand. But deep down, she knew that lie wouldn't hold up for long. As the investigation deepened, Abana's nerves began to fray. Every knock on her door, every phone call, every unexpected visit from a friend or family member made her heart race. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if the police were getting closer to discovering the truth. The flames of her jealousy, once hot and burning bright, now felt like a quiet, simmering ember inside her. Her boyfriend, Danny, had been unreachable since the fire. The guilt gnawed at her. She hadn't expected things to go this far. She hadn't expected Melissa's house, the home that had been her battleground, to be consumed by the flames. And yet, that wasn't what haunted her the most. What haunted her was the possibility that Danny might never forgive her. That was a reality she wasn't sure she could face, but it was too late to turn back now. The police had already interviewed her once, asking her where she had been that night. She had given the standard answers, acting calm and collected, even as the anxiety twisted in her stomach. But she knew that the more questions they asked, the tighter the noose around her neck would become. And yet, they didn't have enough to charge her. Not yet. But the truth was clear to her. The walls were closing in. Days turned into weeks, and the tension was palpable. The investigation showed no signs of slowing down. It wasn't just the fire that had people talking, it was the fact that both Danny's mother and the children had died in the blaze. They had no way of knowing what started it. There were no signs of foul play, at least not at first. But rumors were beginning to spread. One evening, Danny finally called. His voice was distant, strained, as though he were 1,000 miles away. But the words he spoke, the way he said them, made Abana's heart drop. "I know what you did, Abana." She froze, the world going completely still around her. A wave of panic rushed over her. Her throat felt tight, and she couldn't find the words to speak. All she could do was stand there, listening to Danny's voice on the other end of the line, a voice that seemed to grow colder with every passing second. "Danny, I didn't—" she started, but he cut her off. Don't lie to me. I've seen the reports. I know it was you." There was no accusation in his voice, only the cold certainty of someone who had already made up their mind. "I'm done, Abana." Her stomach twisted into knots. Danny, the one person who had been her anchor, the one who had promised to love her despite everything, was gone. She heard the click of the phone disconnecting, and suddenly everything she had feared had come to pass. He was gone. She was alone. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and Abana's life seemed to spiral further out of control. Her every move was being watched. The police had started focusing their attention on her, digging deeper into her background, her relationship with Danny, and the increasingly suspicious details of her whereabouts on the night of the fire. Abana tried to keep up the facade, playing the role of the grieving girlfriend, the one who had lost everything. But the cracks were starting to show. Her emotions were frayed, her paranoia growing. She had stopped sleeping, stopped eating. All she could do was think about the destruction she had caused. Her apartment felt like a cage. The wall seemed to close in on her with every passing day. Abana had been careful. She had taken every precaution. But one mistake, one slip-up, was all it took for the police to start suspecting her. Her phone buzzed one afternoon, the name flashing across the screen. It was Detective Harris, the one who had been leading the investigation. Her heart skipped a beat. "Abana, we need you to come down to the station for a few more questions," he said, his voice smooth, yet heavy with an underlying tension. "Okay," she responded, her throat dry. The word "okay" felt wrong. She could hear the gears of the investigation turning in the background. They were closing in. She knew this would be the point where everything fell apart. At the police station, Abana was led into a small, sterile room, the smell of coffee and stale air mixing in the space. Detective Harris sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He was quiet for a moment, staring at her, as though waiting for her to speak. "I know what happened, Abana," he said at last, his voice low and calm. "I don't need to ask you why you did it. I know you were angry. I know you had your reasons." Abana's stomach turned. Her hands, which had been gripping the edge of the chair, were now slick with sweat. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she stammered. "It was just a mistake. It was never supposed to go that far." "You think I don't know that?" Harris replied, his eyes narrowing. "You wanted to send a message, to Melissa, to everyone who thought you were second-rate. But you didn't just hurt her. You killed 3 people, Abana. You're lucky it wasn't worse." Abana opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Her guilt, her fear, her shame, it all came crashing down on her at once. She had crossed a line. There was no going back from this. "We have evidence. Witnesses saw you near the house that night. Your phone records place you in the vicinity. And your actions, throwing that brick, lighting the fire, it's all too much to ignore." Abana's hands trembled as she wiped away a tear. She could see the writing on the wall. She was done. Her life was over. The trial was swift. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters and onlookers, all eager to see the woman who had set the fire that claimed the lives of Melissa Weston and her grandchildren. Abana sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze downcast. She could barely look anyone in the eye. The weight of her guilt was unbearable. Danny didn't show up. His absence felt like an indictment of its own. She had no one left, no one to fight for her. She was alone. The prosecutor laid out the case with cold precision, detailing Abana's jealousy, her rage, and her actions on that fateful night. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Abana was responsible for the fire. When the verdict came, it was a simple one: guilty. Abana was sentenced to life in prison, a fate she had never truly imagined. It wasn't the death sentence she had feared, but in some ways, it was worse. Life without the chance of redemption, life without the people she once loved, was a fate she would have to endure. In her cell, Abana could still hear the echoes of that night, the sound of glass shattering, the crackle of fire consuming everything in its path. And in the quiet moments, when she allowed herself to feel, she realized the truth. Her jealousy, her anger, had destroyed everything. It had cost her her future, her freedom, and her humanity. And though she could never undo what had been done, one thought stayed with her in the darkness of her cell. She had chosen the wrong path, and now there was no escape.